Welcome back, folks, to the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. On today's show, we have Tyler Gildin, who is a member of the family that owns Satco, Greg.
Yeah, real interesting story. Good discussion we have from today.
Yeah, he created a documentary on his grandfather, Herbert Gildin, who founded Satco and was a Holocaust survivor and recently passed away. And he did a documentary on his grandfather called The Starfish. And what a fascinating story. Now, there are a lot of tragic Holocaust stories out there, and we all know about what a crazy time that was and what those people went through. But this one's a story of hope. It's a story of overcoming adversity, and it's an American story. So check it out, The Starfish. Of course, this episode is brought to you by those that do the right thing and the light thing. That's Satco, Greg, SATCO.com, baby, Satco.com.
Yeah, and I think if you watch a Starfish documentary and you have any idea of who Satco is as a company, it'll all come together nicely. It really shows who they are as people, who they are as a company, and why they are one of the leaders in the lighting industry.
So go to satco.com. That's SATCO.com. And thanks to the Gildin family, Tyler, wonderful time interviewing, and of course, Al and Karen. Thank you for setting this all up. But for right now, folks, here comes Tyler Gildin. Welcome to the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast, Tyler Gildin.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Say hello to Greg Eric.
Hello. How are you?
Good, Tyler. Thanks for coming on.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's our pleasure. So we had a trip down to, actually, I'll start with my interview with Alan Karen. I've known Alan for many years and got to know him real well in the last year or so while he's been on the board with Nailed, and I interviewed him on the show. And during that time, we were talking about the future of the industry and people with deep roots in lighting. And, Greg and I were talking about the show and what to do. And, then we went down to Satco and we visited you guys. We're very, what a great time we had with Alan, and visited the head office there in Long Island. And, we're got a feeling that there's this company has deep roots. There's a real family feel when you walk in. You see the way the thing that it's all set up. And we met Billy. We had dinner with Billy, and then we interviewed Billy, your father, of course, Billy Gildin. And I had a feeling that there was something deep there. And then Greg and I started talking about some of the stories behind the lighting industry and incorporating maybe one of those a month or one of those a quarter in. And then out of the blue, Alan Karen emails me with this documentary, The Starfish. And so I just watched it last night, and that is a story, man. Wow.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Yeah, it is certainly a story that I felt was worth telling, and I'm glad so far people seem to, agree with that.
Well, I mean, I don't want to be a spoiler for anybody, but we're here to talk about the documentary, and from Sweden. He crosses the entire world to get to America. And then
that's the thing that stood out to me as how crazy a journey that was, going the other way. I think take the boat across that way and get there quick.
And so just for the listeners out there listening here, there's a documentary that Tyler Gildin's created on his grandfather, Herbert Gildin, and the two sisters, Cece, and what was the other one's name?
It was Seal and Margaret.
Seal and Margaret. And, their journey out of Germany in the late 1930s to Sweden and then off to the United States. And what an incredible journey that was. Tell us how, because we want to leave some of the story for people that are going to watch it, of course. Tell me how the idea came to you and Gildin Media to do this.
Sure. Well, first just to backtrack on, that journey, it's crazy. And that, I was trying to really show that on the maps, that idea of, had they gone just, one way, it could have been an easy trip. But the fact is, because of the war, they had to avoid it. And the fact that they had to go all the way pretty much around the globe to get to the United States, through Russia to Japan to Seattle to New York is remarkable, and just shows that, the extent that they had to do and Hayas, the organization, to help them was pretty incredible. But to your other question, in terms of just the documentary itself, I always knew my grandfather had a, pretty special story. I didn't didn't necessarily know the details of it, but I knew that he had this incredible background. And I think the moment for me where it really struck that I really wanted to tell the story was when his older sister Seal had passed away in 2017. At the funeral, my grandfather in his eulogy told a bit about the story, about the three children, and that specific journey that you just mentioned of what that was like, and the idea that this wasn't, they weren't, they were on a train and a boat. This wasn't a cruise ship and an Acela train. They were on a cargo ship. They were on a cargo train. And just when he described that whole story and how important Seal was to him as the older sister and the mother shepherding him, I just knew then that I really wanted to capture the story. I work in production. I have the resources and the capabilities. My grandfather at the time was 88 years old, and it felt like I would be doing a disservice if I didn't at the least just sit him down and interview him. What the extent of the documentary would become, or whether it would be a documentary, I didn't know. It was just like, okay, I have cameras, I have crews. Let me sit down, talk to my grandfather, talk to my grandma, and capture that story and kind of take it from there.
So Herbert Gildin is the founder of Satco, which is a wonderful lighting company, American lighting company. He's a Holocaust survivor along with his two sisters, just for those listening to give you a preface. And we don't want to give away too much of the story because it's actually, it's well timed. It's 45 minutes, I think, and it's super interesting. So watch it when it comes out. But Tyler, tell me, why did it take so long for your grandfather to, in a way, I guess there's some demons there, and there's some darkness there, there's some pain, there's some sorrow, there's a lot of powerful emotions. Why did it take so long for him to want to share this with his family and then the world, really?
Sure. I think, my grandfather was somebody who he's a very, always focused on the future. He's someone who's always thinking about, what's next. He's not a nostalgic person. He's not someone who would focus on the past. And you also have to remember, he was so young when this all happened. He was from the ages of 10 to 12. So a lot of those memories, I think you suppress them as a child and you kind of just want to move on. You're in a new country, trying to start a new life. And I think as he was getting older, specifically with Satco and trying to build a business, he wanted to be Herb Gildin, the businessman. I don't think he wanted to be Herb Gildin, the Holocaust survivor. I think he wanted to be somebody who was building something, looking forward. And it just was something that he, whether it was intentionally suppressed or just because he was so focused on trying to make a name for himself, I think, he had so much, there's so much turmoil growing up for him. And so, a lack of stability that I think he just was driven to build something stable and successful. And it really, if it were not for my aunt, his daughter, Mindy, really being so interested in her own roots and therefore in his roots, he may never have initially even opened up about, any of his backstory.
Do you think this experience that he went through made him the person he became?
Totally. I think for sure. I think that's resilience, persistence, just being a fighter. I think all of that came from, his upbringing and, just the amount of times he was from A to B to C. I mean, he was really kind of like a chameleon. I mean, everywhere he went, he was German, he went to Sweden, he had to learn how to speak Swedish. And then he comes to the US and he knows German and Swedish. He's got to learn to speak English. And then, he's off in the army and he's the only Jew in the army and he's got to figure out how to adapt. It seems like everywhere he went, he was an outcast, and everywhere he went, he figured out a way to adapt and be a likable person and a successful person. I think that speaks to, his track record of success.
It's interesting that adversity can be a gift. Sure. And what I took from that story personally is giving thanks for the adversity in my life. And it's crazy to say that, but Greg's question, did that make him? I think, your grandfather could have chosen to be a victim. He could have worn, and I'm not minimizing this in any sense. He could have chosen to go internally and mourn the loss, but instead he made another choice. He chose to live his life in the future and move forward and build something. And I think, while your grandfather's story is absolutely remarkable, I think we all make that choice in one way or another. We all have the choice to choose victimhood or to choose to carve our own destiny with what we're given. And what I take from that story is that, hey, man, as hard as you have it, it can get a hell of a lot worse really, really quickly for you. And, you talk about a boy 10 years old and the emotions he described so accurately as a 10-year-old boy. From in the first family in Sweden he lived with before he moved to the silo family, and the pain and the anguish. Those are powerful emotions for a 10-year-old. I don't know, none of my 10-year-olds felt those kind of emotions. I'm pretty sure the Eric boys don't have those kind of emotions, but there's a gift to that adversity in a sense if you accept it the right way.
No, 100%. And I think that's kind of the person that he was. And it was. He's not someone who's ever going to look for a pity parade. He's not someone who's going to be, down on himself. I think he was someone who just wanted to work harder, and he wanted to prove himself. I think it was always trying to prove to others. And, he says towards the end of the piece, how he finally felt so comfortable in his own skin, and he had everything he wanted. And I just think, we should all be so fortunate to live that type of a life. And he looks at his life as, a positive. He lived a great life. Sure, some of his younger years were challenging, but at the end of the day, lived 90 years and had a beautiful wife, family, kids, grandkids. He got to meet his great grandson, my son. So I think he looked at life in that positive perspective, that he was very happy with everything he had. And I think those earlier moments kind of shaped him a bit, and he just was someone who just knew how to, in every situation, find the best, surround himself with the best people, and work hard, and was very goal oriented, and that's why he was such a successful guy.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that we noticed too on our trip to Satco. Unfortunately, Michael and I didn't get to meet him, but he had passed away, I think, just last year. Is that right? 2019.
Last May, yeah, about a year ago. May. A year ago this week, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and he and everything I was told is that he was still working up until what, 88, 90? Was he still going into the office?
He was, he was at that point, he was in Florida, but still on calls, okay, and or possibly going into the office in Florida. But whenever he was in New York, he would stop in. He was someone who never officially retired. Obviously my dad has been really running the company for quite some time, but even just as a springboard to bounce ideas off of, my dad and my grandfather spoke every day. And yeah, just in my life and in my business and in anything I'd done, there was nobody better to just bounce anything off of than my grandfather, because he was just somebody that when you spoke to him, he was very good at making it clear that you were the only thing he was focusing on. And whatever your issue was, he wanted to help you solve it, or he wanted to hear it out. He was just an incredible listener, and then would give you advice that, was just very valuable. Just wisdom like that doesn't just come around so often. So we were very fortunate to have him.
In the story, you really did a great job, Tyler, at, and I assume you were the director and the producer and put it all together. What I found deeply moving was the highlighting of how difficult it was for your grandfather to leave his Swedish family. And I found that fascinating. And then moving forward, it's almost like a preface to how the man was able to recognize good things and not want to let them go and preserve them, and how that kind of fed into his business acumen in a way. Because when you look at his time in Sweden, it's almost idyllic. In the story, it's described by him and by the pictures and everything as almost the greatest moments of his childhood. And, at the end moving toward the end, the reunion between his Swedish sister and him is extremely moving, especially when you interview the son and you hear him talking about his mom. I suppose his Swedish sister had passed on by that point.
Yep.
And talking about how much this had meant to them. And, I really felt like that was integral in his mind, in his heart, that quest for stability, to hold on to good things, to keep things together that are good, really came from his time in Sweden with that Swedish family.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and I agree. I think, one of the more, to me, fascinating, quotes or, situations he faced was that idea of, he had a good thing in Sweden. He had a family who loved him, and he was very happy there, and he knew he would be leaving a good thing for a complete uncertainty. And obviously he went and, traveled to America to reconnect with his parents, but was living in a much, much less fortunate situation than he had been in Sweden. And I think he enjoyed his time in Sweden as a kid. He was getting that attention and, having a good time. So, yeah, it was very interesting for him to have to, when he discusses that, because you would think, oh, you're leaving to go with your family in America. That's amazing. And he was, I guess, self-aware, at least there, or looking back now, self-aware to understand that it was a tough decision, that he wasn't necessarily leaving for a greater opportunity, but that it still was the right one to do. And yeah, I think, he was very close with, as you see in the piece, with Agneta, his
Agneta,
Swedish
yes.
sister. They were close at the time, and I think obviously they lost connection. But when he reconnected, how important that was. And I think something that I actually learned after the film, as I've kind of discussed further with Zacharias, who is Agneta's son, who we do interview in the film, was how important Herb was to his grandmother. So Agneta's mother, when they adopted Herb, you got to understand, when they took him in, I don't know, but the percentage chances that he was ever going to leave to reconnect with his family in the U.S. was very slim.
Sure.
They weren't taking him in to harbor him. They were adopting him to be part of their family. So I think it was actually devastating for the mother when she lost Herb, because it was almost like she had lost a child. She had taken him in for 2 years, fully feeling like this was now going to be another member of her family. And, in the piece, we mentioned how she came and visited once, and, the conflict between Herb's actual mother and his Swedish mother in terms of
That's very
seeing each other.
strange to
Yeah.
me, Tyler. That's so strange to me. Like, you're talking about deep emotions of motherhood conflicting with one another, in people's hearts, man.
Yeah.
That's a jealous mother, who is jealous of another mother who had helped raise her son. That was a really human part of the story, man. I really like that you kept that in there.
Yeah, because and whether it's jealousy or just an internal, and I think my aunt, spoke about it so eloquently, of just that idea of she just couldn't come to terms with the idea that she had to have given up her child for those 2 years. And you would think that she'd want to meet the woman who
Embrace
had
her,
taken, you'd think so. But, I guess, I don't know if we were all in that situation, or what we wanted, you'd think, but maybe it was just too dark and too hard for her to know that she had to give up her 10-year-old boy, and that just, meeting that Swedish mother would have brought all that emotions back to her that she just couldn't handle. But yeah, it's a very real moment. It was the only time throughout the entire time that I interviewed my grandfather that he kind of broke a bit, was when he spoke about that. So I knew I had to keep that in the piece.
There was some resentment in his eyes when he talked about that. And that's what makes your presentation of the story in all its nuances and the dark and the light together, I think, is so key to making it a good piece, like a real piece of human struggle and overcoming adversity. Think about the Swedish mother who comes to love this boy. He starts to like Christmas. He's going to church with them. He talks about going to church and enjoying Christmas and the Christmas trees in the background in one of the pictures. And it's actually like a almost idyllic the way it looks as you're watching it. And then for that mother, what are you going to do? Oh, yeah, we're going to take a train across the Soviet Union to Japan. And then we're going to take a boat across the Pacific Ocean. And the one in charge is a 15-year-old, 14-year-old girl. I mean, that's really like to let that happen, and to, obviously that's the family's choice in a sense, but man, those are crazy times, eh? Holy mackerel.
Yeah, I think that's why I think, I didn't mention it much in the piece because I really didn't know as much until afterwards. But yeah, that apparently that was a really big burden on his Swedish mother, his heart. And I think she always felt like she kind of lost a son there in that. But obviously, they did what they felt and that their, birth parents felt was necessary for them to do to reconnect. And they were shepherded by the organization Hayas. Obviously it was the 3 children, but they weren't just completely alone. They were part of some group, even though they didn't necessarily know who. My grandfather couldn't remember who, but I guess there were some adults that had to have been shepherding them a bit. But yeah, it's crazy, because you'd think now, to let 3 young children, even just go into Manhattan by themselves, you might say, hey, what are you doing? Have your phone on, GPS. I want to track you. I want to whatever. And this was just 7 weeks. We'll see. It's crazy.
Now, you mentioned it in the film, but at the end of the day, what drove your grandfather to be successful?
I think it was just completely that fear of failure. I think he was somebody who he was motivated by that fear of failure. He wanted to do better. He wanted to prove himself, whether it was to himself, whether it was to his father-in-law, who he didn't have the approval of. He just didn't want to be looked at somebody who was lower than anybody else as an immigrant or anything. He just wanted to be seen as a successful businessman, and he just had that motivation and that power to move forward in really every aspect of his life. And he wasn't the quote unquote family man because he was working all day. And I think that was something that my grandmother understood, and was his partner as well as Lou and Margaret, his brother-in-law, and his sister. And yeah, the four of them really just did what it took to get Satco off the ground, and then make it into what it ultimately became.
Do you think he ever truly felt that he was successful and satisfied with that success?
It's a good question. I think if he ever did, he wouldn't have been as successful as he ultimately became. I think finally,
Right.
when I was interviewing him and he's 88 years old and he's saying, "I'm happy with everything," I think finally then, but he's not someone who would have ever sat down and gleamed over his success. That's just not the type of guy my grandfather was.
Do you guys still have the shoes? The shoe that the money was in?
Nah. Do not have those shoes. I'm sure they would probably crumble, are so old and decrepit. But no, and that's what's interesting about a story like that is, and why I felt it was necessary to interview my grandfather's sister's daughters, because his sisters were not alive at the time, was to get those types of narratives and those anecdotes, because that's not a story that my grandfather remembered at all. That wasn't something, he was 10 years old to 12 years old, and he didn't remember that. But obviously, his sister, who was 14 to 16, did remember that and passed that on to her daughter. So that's why it was so important to, I felt, to have somebody represent all the key players if they were not alive to speak for themselves. And that included both his sisters and his sweetest sister. Having the next generation speak for them, I think, just helped add layers to the story.
Yeah, that was the most moving part of the story for me, just as an individual, is where like they pulled out the shoes and they had the money, but it was worthless. I'm almost crying
Yeah.
thinking about it now. I mean, seriously, that was really moving, Tyler. It really, the way you held on to that as a director, and you didn't bring it up all the way through Sweden, and then they get to Seattle, it's still then New York, and they pull out the shoes and the money's there, and to give it back to the dad, but it's worthless. Oh man, it was very moving the way you set it up, and also the story of itself.
Appreciate it.
The one quote from your grandfather that I think is prescient right now, especially with what we're going through in these times, was when he said, "I was just surprised." Again, this is a quote. "I was surprised at what freedom actually was." Here's a guy, he grows up, he's a kid. He doesn't know the Nazis come to power in 33 or whatever it was, and all this stuff's happening, and he doesn't notice anything until the Kristallnacht. Lots of stuff happened
Right.
before the Kristallnacht, but he's a kid, and all of a sudden he's kicked out of school, and his friends are not allowed to play with him anymore. Right? So he's living in this authoritarian regime where people have double speak, that Orwellian double speak, that to be careful what they say, they have to hide who they are.
Right.
Then he goes to the Soviet Union, and he's going, he gets to New York, and all of a sudden people are listening to the radio, and they're like, "President's an idiot." And your grandfather's what? What you just said? What? And so that idea of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and he's encountering this for the first time. And I think it's almost better to encounter it like that way than to grow up with it, because you really learn to appreciate it, and you can see a lot of new Canadians and new Americans, people that come here and they see this. It's so valuable, and it's hard to pass on to people that grow up with it how incredibly rare it is, actually.
No, totally. Yeah, I thought that was, one of the awesome, more interesting, quotes that he had, that really stood out. Because yeah, it's something that you don't think of. You don't really, if you grew up in the U.S. or Canada, you don't really think about that. And when he said that, I was like, oh wow, that's pretty cool. That he like vividly remembered that. Like that was one of his like earlier memories of being in the U.S. Being in Brooklyn. Yeah, no, I thought that was pretty special. And given the world we're living in now, yeah, I think that can definitely relate to people remembering, having some perspective on some of the liberties that we do have.
How long did this documentary take you to make?
So I began filming in May of 2017, so about 3 years ago. It took me about a year and a half to 2 years. I initially finished it before he passed, and then I did go back after he passed and updated some of the ending title cards just to have that full, closure bookend of the film. But about a year and a half. But I'm someone who also is a bit of a perfectionist, so even when I was done, I went back a couple times and did a new sound mix. I did a new coloring. It was very hard, and especially also after he passed, I kind of felt like I was holding on to him somewhat through the film. So I think a lot of times my nitpicking of going back to the film was, subconsciously just trying to continue my relationship with him.
And I've got two questions. What did he think of the process, and then what did he think of the final result?
I think, so when I first went and I interviewed him, I showed up with, a crew of about four of us, two cameras, boom mic. I think at first he was even still just like, whoa, this is more than I kind of thought was going to happen. I don't know what exactly he anticipated, if it was just going to be me and an old school camcorder. I don't know. But so I think at first he was like, oh, okay, this is a little, we even had a drone just to get some exteriors of his house, which, really cracked up my grandma. She thought that was really cool. But yeah, I think when I first showed him the first draft, like it was kind of like a 2-minute teaser, I could tell he was like, oh, wow, this is, going to be a lot bigger than he necessarily initially thought, just because, some of the archival footage I'd thrown in there. And I think he was realizing a lot more work was going into it than just the one day I had showed up and filmed with him, that I was putting significant amount of time, behind the scenes in post-production. But he was very supportive throughout. I did a lot of pickups with him, a lot of audio pickups. I was constantly showing him rough cuts when I felt they were ready, because it was important. I needed to have, I think almost anything I would probably make in life, I'd want to have his approval on, but specifically something that was about his life story, I really wanted to have his approval on. And just to make sure, sometimes he would say, actually, can we change this? And specifically with anything Satco business related, he also wanted to make sure that that was truthful, but within the realms of what he felt should be shown, from a business standpoint. So he was wearing his hat in two different ways when he was viewing it. But yeah, he very much enjoyed the final piece. He was very proud and very happy, and felt a little bit like a movie star, which was nice for him to kind of feel that way a bit. And I think it was important for him. I think it gave him even further closure on his life story. So yeah, I think he was grateful for it, and I'm grateful that he was obviously willing to divulge all this to me.
Your grandmother, she's an interesting character in this story too, and you don't explore it so much, but there's some conflict there with the father-in-law, with her father and your dad. Was that ever resolved in their lifetimes together?
So what's interesting is, the initial, so the film right now is 40 minutes, and the initial cut was 48 minutes. And I trimmed it down because when I was doing the festival circuit, a 48-minute film just didn't fit any category. And I'm happy with the final piece at 40. I think it's tighter and it works. But part of the 48-minute piece did have a bit more actually on Sacco, and specifically also on my grandmother's family and their dynamic. And yeah, we spoke a little bit more about her father, Al. Yeah, he pretty much just did not approve of my grandfather. And I think that was just something that, whether it was the immigrant story or feeling like his daughter deserved better, which it is ironic because he himself was kind of a entrepreneurial, shady type character who had moved them from Brooklyn down to Florida because he was in the nightclub business and he was in the alcohol business. He had a lot of different hats and was a shifty type of guy. So it's kind of ironic that he didn't appreciate someone who was a, really blue collar, hardworking guy. But yeah, I think, my grandfather says it at the end, he wishes the two people who could have seen his success was his own father for the pride he would have had, and his father-in-law for saying, hey, I actually, your daughter did okay. She married the right guy. But yeah, I thought that was important to add that in the piece, just the bits that we did add, because it was just showing a bit more of a conflict. And that's a human thing of having disapproval from an in-law. That's a real thing that exists today and will probably always exist.
And yeah, it's one of those things that, a lot of that is projection. A lot of that is people projecting their own negativity onto others. And seeing, those types of things going on in other people and not accepting them. And so that came through, but I was interested in that side angle, and so just watching the story, I wanted to know a little bit more. I'm like, I wonder what happened there. Now, was your grandmother born Jewish, or did she convert?
No, she was born Jewish, so there
Okay.
was definitely no like anti-Jewish. There might have been an anti-immigrant. That he was an immigrant from Germany, but in terms of being Jewish, she was Jewish, and she also grew up in not very comfortable living either. So there's a lot of strangeness there. And as much as I pride on my grandma to tell me more about her father, she also suppresses a bit. She was pretty honest about who he was, but also there were some things that, as we were interviewing, we were trying to extract a bit more, and she was a bit sensitive on her own father, who was clearly a very controversial character in her life.
So Satco has the spirit of Herbert Gildin in it. How does your father, Billy, the CEO, he's the CEO or the president or both?
I think he's the president and CEO.
How does he embody your grandfather's characteristics? And does Satco live that out as a corporate culture, the resilience, the dedication, the focus on the future? Does he embody all that? Is that where the spirit lies, or is there someone else in the family business that's there that's holding Herbert's spirit and holding down the soul of the company?
No, it's definitely my dad. My dad and my grandfather were incredibly close, and I think my dad's work ethic came from my grandfather. And a portion of the piece that I trimmed in when I cut it down was kind of my dad's origin story into the company. And I know in the piece we currently have now, him originally helping unload boxes in their driveway when their warehouse had gone basically at max capacity. But when my father first joined the company, he was first in the warehouse. It took a long time before he eventually became, the president. That wasn't an overnight thing. And my grandma jokingly says, I guess in the outtakes of the piece, how she almost wanted to divorce my grandfather over how hard she was on her son and on my dad. She was so difficult on him, and really,
your grandmother was difficult on your dad.
No, my grandfather was so tough on him that my grandma would say, give him a break. You're so tough on Billy. And I think that's because my grandfather knew that he had to make my father earn that, and that if my dad was ever going to earn the respect that he has, and it's everybody's respect, in Satco, and anyone who's ever come through Satco has the utmost respect for my dad. And I think that's because my grandfather made sure that he started low end of the totem pole and he worked his way up. And he didn't report directly into my grandfather at first. He reported into somebody else who reported into my grandfather. My grandpa was smart enough to know that he wanted there to be that chain of command, and that this was a family business. And my dad says this a lot. It's a family business, but it's not because of the bloodlines of family. It's because it's how they treat people like a family. That's what makes it a family business. And I know my dad would reiterate that today, as well.
When are we going to get you working at Satco?
So this piece is clearly my contribution, but no, I do. So I've done several of the marketing videos. I'm not, my mindset is definitely in more of a creative angle than pure business, but the most recent, corporate video, I directed and produced, and I did last year at Light Fair. I did all their videos. I did their videos in Dallas at the Light Conference there. So I am doing most of their video marketing work, but that will most likely be the extent of my contribution. They say this: the first generation creates it, second generation builds it, third generation destroys it. So yeah, I'm not to be that guy.
Yeah, you go up the stairs in wooden slippers. You go up the stairs in wooden shoes. You come down in silk slippers. That's what they say, right? It's interesting to Satco. You really got the feeling when you really showed him in the warehouse well, and then with the one lady, which he was talking, and it's funny in the age of COVID. I don't even want to say it. I'm not saying it. In the age of this age we live in now, and the way people are behaving, to see someone like your grandfather putting his arm around a stock picker, and the warmth between them. Like pure human warmth that was there, caring. You could see it. Like we humans can see it. You can't pretend that you like somebody or that you know them or that you care for them. We can see it right away on people's faces, and the warmth that was there. When Greg and I visited, there's clearly not a disconnect between the C-suite and the other workers at Satco. It's a family, and when you go there, you see it. And so, Tyler, I really thank you for coming on the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. We didn't tell the Starfish story intentionally because you folks, you want to know why it's called the Starfish. You got to go out and watch it. So, Tyler Gildin, thank you for being a guest on the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast.
Thank you guys. Appreciate you taking the time to watch the film and to enjoying it and to be able to talk about it and help spread it more. I think it's a powerful story. It's a human interest piece, and I hope to get it to as many people as possible and that they can enjoy it.
And where can they find that, Tyler? Give them the website quick.
It's currently, if you go to thestarfishfilm.com or Gildan Media / The Starfish, you'll find it. And the links right now, it's depending on where you're located. It's on Apple TV, it's on Prime, Vudu, Vimeo on Demand, and Google Play.
And we'll also
post links on too.
Yeah, exactly. We'll post all this on the website. And so you listeners out there, you want to hear about how Satco started and the story of the founder. We're going to be putting out more of these. All you listen out there. I know Tyler, I know Greg, and me, we all thank you for listening. Bye for now. The Starfish, Greg. The founder of Satco, satco.com. What a story. What a life.
And you're going to have to watch a documentary to find out why it's a starfish, why it's called that. But an awesome story all around.
Yeah, what a great story. What a great family. And, they welcomed us down in Long Island a couple months ago, Greg, back in December when we went down to visit with them. And what a great family company. And Tyler, thanks for producing that documentary and coming on and telling us all about it. Folks, satco.com. That's satco.com. And if you're listening to this and you graduated LS1, we're putting together a new educational program at the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. It's going to be ongoing training, Greg. I know that's a fancy word right now, but I'll tell you this. Everyone's talking about online training. This training is going to be for lighting distributors, counter salespeople, Greg, outside guys, all the specifics they need to sell lighting.
That's right. Anybody that has anything to do with lighting is going to want to take this course. I can promise you that.
Yeah, I'm actually going to take it. So there you go.
I'm going to. Yeah. Definitely.
So, go to satco.com, go to nail.org. Thanks to Tyler and the Gildin family for giving us the opportunity to discuss the Starfish.
Written on the rectory wall, there's a sign there for all. You are lost, the Lord is there to find you.